All right, welcome everybody to our first virtual session of Quality Tasks. I'm really excited to work with you all. Unfortunately, I did not get the opportunity to meet most of you at the in-person kickoffs this summer, but I will be your lead facilitator for the next 8 weeks in this virtual Quality Tasks experience. And we are here to really continue the good thinking and work that you started in your kickoffs this summer around task design, thinking about authentic literacy, standards alignment, and all of those great components of developing high quality tasks. So I am going to start us off with a little bit of tech orientation so that we're all comfortable in the platform that we're using, since meeting in a PLC in a virtual space like this can sometimes require slightly different norms than we're used to for face-to-face meetings. And also I want you to be familiar with some of the features of Zoom. So many of you have already tried this as you were logging in and getting situated, but one thing that you might want to do, especially since we have a larger group, is be able to see everybody on your screen at the same time. So the way that you can do that is by switching to gallery view. And there should be a button in the top right corner of your Zoom window with a little grid of boxes that allows you to switch over to gallery view instead of speaker view. That gives you what we call like the Brady Bunch view, where you've got everybody's faces all over your screen. And it really helps foster conversation and discussion as we're all here in the window together, so you can see everyone all at once. The other thing that you should know about is using your microphone and camera. So if you have a camera, we strongly encourage you to turn it on so that we can really see you and again, engage in that way. With microphones, there will be many times when we ask you to chime in and talk, but generally speaking, if you're not talking, it's best to keep the microphone on mute just to avoid background noise and that echo and feedback that can happen if you've got multiple computers in the same room. And I know a few of you are together in groups in rooms today, and that can work. We do encourage everybody to log into Zoom on their own device. As Danielle said, oftentimes we ask you to contribute thoughts in the chat. It helps just kind of equalize that participation. So for future weeks, it really helps us, and that also gives us a clear picture of who all is here. The other thing right before we get into some of our exciting content for today is you'll notice that your name appears underneath of your picture, and sometimes they appear as initials or just a last name depending on what your account has. If what you're seeing as your name does not represent what you would actually like us to call you, you can simply click on your name and you should get an option to rename in that drop-down menu, and you can type in your first name or whatever you go by so that it's easier for us to refer to one another by our preferred names. So take a moment now just to get situated, make sure you're in gallery view, check that your name is accurate and reflecting how you'd like to be called, and then we will start off with a little bit of a reflection in the chat, which is another important feature of Zoom that we'll use pretty frequently. While you're doing that, I'm going to briefly share my screen, which is another thing that we use really frequently here to kind of show what we're doing in one place. And I just want to point out a couple of key things in the calendar invite for this meeting that might be useful to you. So the calendar invite, we keep kind of key resources inside of the notes of that calendar invite so that in case you're not sure where to find something, you can always just come back to your calendar and find this. Not only will you find the Zoom link that we'll use to meet every week, it'll be the same link consistently, but you will also find a link to our cohort's collection and core tools, and this is where we will house the modules that you're working on, as well as links to other important resources, and a link to the Quality Tasks syllabus or homepage. So everything is there in the calendar invite. If all else fails and you're going, I'm not sure where to find my stuff, you can go right back to the calendar invite and it should have the key things that you need. All right. So to get us started, before we begin with getting into core tools and doing some thinking work together around task design, we're not going to go around and do verbal introductions of everybody in the group, but we will always start our sessions with a little bit of a reflection in the chat. Now, most weeks, this is going to be a reflection on the work and the thinking that you did that week in between our PLC sessions. Since this is our first session today, I'm going to ask you to find the chat window. If it's not already open, again, along the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see kind of a chat bubble that will pop open the Zoom chat window. And you can type a message there either to everyone in the group, or if you click on that blue bubble that says everyone, you can pick individual names and also do private chats with other folks in the group. We'll use that from time to time to do kind of think, pair, share as part of our virtual structure. But for the moment, we're going to invite everybody to post just a brief comment in the chat to everyone. And what I'd like you to post is simply thinking back. I know a lot has probably happened between your in-person kickoff and this Friday morning, but thinking back to that 2-day launch of this work, what is one thing that a takeaway that is still kind of sticking with you from that work, or maybe something that you shared with a colleague? So kind of re-anchoring yourself in the work that you did together in your 2-day in-person kickoff, and thinking about what's one takeaway that's still sticking with you from that event. And you'll notice that Danielle, my co-facilitator for today, hi Danielle, just posted that comment in the chat. So we'll always try to do that when we ask you to think about a question. We'll pop that question in the chat so that you can see it visually as well as hearing it verbally. A like button would be nice in the chat. I am totally on board with that. Maybe we'll write a little request to Zoom. All right, tons of great thinking and ideas there. Really exciting to see a little bit of what resonated with you from that event, since I wasn't able to be with you there in person. The thing that I'm excited about this morning is also hearing a little bit about what everybody's thinking about working on for the task that they're going to design during this 8 weeks. So we'll get there shortly, but as you finish up posting your thoughts into the chat, we're going to do a couple more minutes of just orientation to the resources that we are going to be using during this 8-week session, and how to kind of toggle and navigate between Zoom, where we are meeting to talk about things, and Core Tools, where you'll be going into the Learn tab to dig into some of that content and do some of your thinking and work on your module. So at the moment, we are simply here in Zoom, and you may still be in full screen mode. Oftentimes, Zoom defaults to full screen mode when you open it up to join a meeting. So what you can do to leave full screen mode in order to be able to use other things on your computer while we're in the meeting together, I just like to hit escape on my keyboard. That is the simplest way to get out of full screen mode. But also in the top right corner of your Zoom window, there should be a little 4 arrows icon that allows you to enter or leave full screen mode. So I'm going to ask everybody to go ahead and exit full screen mode so that you are prepared to open up a couple of browser windows, which we'll use to access core tools. And before you go off into your browser and start doing that, I'm going to share my screen for a moment to model what you're going to want to have open in a given session. So basically, we're going to be going back and forth between Zoom and core tools. I'm going to share my screen. And what I have open here is actually several tabs in my browser all open to core tools. And that may seem a little silly at first, but I'm going to tell you why that is and why you might want to do the same thing as you're working here in our PLC sessions. So there are several sort of set places in core tools that you're going to be going to regularly. The first key place for these sessions is the Learn tab. So you all should be familiar with this. You used it quite a bit during your summer kickoff, but there's a feature that I really want to highlight here that is new to the Learn tab, and it's going to help us kind of stay oriented to our work each week. So when you're in core tools and you're inside of the Learn tab, there is a further subdivision where you see right here, it says viewing LDC learner or LDC leader. So we use this language a lot of kind of wearing 2 hats, your learner hat and your leader hat. Sometimes you're going to be here as a learner, engaging in the same professional learning content that you would then go and facilitate with others. That's what you'll see on the LDC Learner tab. That's where you're going to see our key instructional cycle courses that really focus in on tasks, skills, and instruction. We will use a lot of this content in our work together, but we also have another layer. Since you're here as part of a coach certification journey, you are also going to be utilizing the LDC Leader tab. And this is where you will find essentially our syllabus for these 8 weeks. This is really the home base where you can go each week to find out what are we going to focus on during our virtual PLC and what is the work that you're being asked to do between PLCs to develop your module and absorb some of this learning content. So we will always be in the quality tasks course for this 8-week session. And this is simply organized by weeks. So for example, if you open week 1, which is where we are right now, there's a little bit of extra front loading here since it's the first week. It gives you kind of a layout of how we're going to do our synchronous work here together in Zoom with our virtual PLCs, as well as some asynchronous work in between sessions to develop your task. A little bit of an overview of your weekly commitments as part of this course. But then here is really the important stuff, and this will appear in every week's session. It's really, again, just a syllabus in virtual form so that you can see in the left side of the column during our PLC in week 1, what are we going to focus on, links to some resources we might use. And then after the PLC, your asynchronous learning, essentially what's the homework between sessions. And that will also similarly link you out to everything that you will need. So we'll come back to this at the end of today's session since we will do next steps in kind of the last 5 minutes of every session. But you'll see that this is kind of the bullet point summary of what you'll be doing. And the key step here is to complete instructional cycle 1, session 2, selecting your focus standards and template. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. In each week's syllabus space, it also gives you an opportunity to kind of confirm that you have completed the steps, both in our virtual PLC participation and your asynchronous learning. And that's just kind of a self-check to help you go, okay, yes, this is what I needed to do, and I can literally check it off and submit that. And then each week there will also be a reflection that you're asked to complete. So this week, since it's our first time together, we asked you to think a little bit in the chat about something that was resonating with you from your in-person kickoff. Generally speaking, at the beginning of each PLC session, what we'll have you do is share your reflection from that week's asynchronous learning. And what's kind of neat about this is that every week you'll have a prompt, sometimes a choice of prompts, and you'll get to type in your reflection in this space, right? So I'm just going to say, hey, this is my reflection. Lots of typos today, and submit it. And that way, when you come into our virtual PLC and I'll say, hey, go ahead and in the chat, share your reflection from this week, All you'll have to do is literally copy and paste whatever you wrote that week, pop it into the chat. It's right there as a way to kind of kickstart and generate our conversation for that week. So we will revisit this. You know, we're walking through the tools kind of quickly, but I just want to give you a quick orientation to where you can look to find out what you should be paying attention to or doing in any given week. So I'm going to have this tab stay open to my leader tab, to the quality tasks syllabus. And then in another tab, I'm going to stick with the LDC learner content. So I think that you all had a chance to get oriented to the structure of our courses and the way that they are designed in instructional cycles. One thing I want to quickly point out, we're going to be doing most of our work for quality tasks inside of instructional cycle 1, since the focus is task. So clearly that's what we're really paying attention to. But even inside of instructional cycle 1, there are 2 options, right? There's adapt a standards-driven task, and there's design a standards-driven task. These are both available to you. You would use adapt if you were working with others on taking existing modules from the LDC library and just tweaking or customizing them a little bit for use in their own classroom. But we are really going to focus our attention on the design option, design a standards-driven task, so that you get the opportunity to experience the full design cycle, the full design process, really from scratch. And become very familiar with the content here so that you can also support others in using it. We have a couple of resources if you're interested in thinking more about the structure of the courses in terms of what adapt versus design really means or how the design course is structured. Danielle is popping some links to those resources in the chat right now so that you have access to them. We're not going to spend a lot more time on it, but that's just a resource for you if you want to think more about the structure of the courses. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen briefly just to see if there are any questions about the technology, about where you should be looking in the Learn tab, and then I'm going to have you all start getting set up in the Learn tab so that we can do some learning and talking together over the next 40 minutes. So let me just stop there. Any questions? So these links, the link to the quality task syllabus is in the calendar invite, and then other links to key resources that we need will be inside of our group's core tools collection. I'll show that to you again later. Any other questions? Well, something fun's happening out there. All right, that's enough of the orientation, look here, tech there. As we're going through this work, any questions that you have, just feel free to pop them in the chat or unmute and chime in. So let's dig into some actual thinking work together. We really want this time to be an opportunity to share ideas, dig into the content, and not just listen to me talk, which is what you've been doing for the last few minutes. So I apologize for that as we get started here. What I'd like you to do now is, again, if you're not already, leave full screen mode in Zoom and go ahead and open a browser and navigate to Core Tools, get inside of that Learn tab so that you are set up to begin doing some learning and thinking. So if you are still watching my screen, I'm just going to navigate the pathway that you would use to get where we need to go in the next couple of minutes. We are going to be working in instructional cycle 1, so you would do that by clicking Learn, scrolling down to instructional cycle 1, standards-driven tasks. If it's not already open, you're going to design a standards-driven task. And for the moment, session 1. So you all already did a lot of the work from session 1 and some of session 2 during your face-to-face days. We are just going to briefly revisit that as kind of a refresh to get our brains back in thinking mode about where in your curriculum do you want to explore content through literacy, and really embed a rich LDC module literacy assignment. So you will notice that there's the action item about deciding when to teach your module. This is what you did together in your face-to-face days as you were thinking about your goals for the module that you're going to design in this course. And again, Danielle has posted a link giving you a direct path to what we're looking at in Core Tools right now. So you have already made some decisions about where in the curriculum you would like to see a literacy assignment help students do some deep thinking. The next step from that, as we transition into session 2, is to really decide on your focus standards. So if you'll recall this star graphic, there are lots of different entry points into designing a task, right? If you're in ELA, you might be starting with a great text that you know is important for students to read. If you're in science or social studies, you might be starting with a really important topic that provides great opportunities for critical thinking. But even if you're starting in one of those other places, the really key first step to designing a coherent and rigorous task is to select your focus standards cluster. And that is, for most disciplines, that combination of reading, writing, and content, or for ELA, sometimes 2 reading standards together with a writing standard that will drive the design of your task and structure the thinking work that your students are doing in the assignment. So even though you've already seen this session, I'd like to take a few minutes to review it and generate some conversation. So what I'm going to have you do is reread a little bit of this session, starting here where I'm showing the think and practice with the star graphic, and scrolling down to read through this section until you get to the slideshow here, the embedded slideshow using focus standards to raise rigor in a task. Go ahead and click through those slides, review this content. And then if you're ELA and you have time, you might want to check out this design tip, because that's specific to design within English language arts. But for everybody, what I'd like you to do over the next few minutes is just read and refresh, starting at think and practice, going through selecting your focus standards cluster, and then clicking through the slideshow, the do now, using focus standards to raise rigor in a task. And since this is a review of this content, the question I'd like you to keep in mind as you read is, what line or section here do you think might be most important to share with others? Or in other words, if you were highlighting as you read this section, what would be a key line or sentence that you would want to highlight from this section? So keep that in mind as you read, and then I'll ask you to share some thoughts in the chat after you've had a few minutes to read. And once you've had a chance to read through that section and click through the slides, if you wouldn't mind coming back to the chat and just popping in a quick ready or done so that I know where you are, that'll help me know when to move on. All right, I'm seeing lots of readies in the chat, and I'm sure there are more to come shortly. So I'd love to hear some thoughts and reflections about this section. We've done a lot of interacting in the chat so far, so now I'd like to invite you to unmute and go ahead and jump into the conversation verbally. And the question is simply, what are some insights or ahas that are standing out to you about focus standards based on the work you did this summer, as well as reading this session? What are some important points or ahas about focus standards that you're really thinking about as we know that you're about to approach this same decision yourself, right? Thinking about selecting a cluster of focus standards to drive the design of your task. What are you thinking?
At the Career and Tech Center, we do a lot of presentations, and I hadn't really thought about using the speaking and listening standards as part of a task, the way it describes in the hint for ELA teachers.
Yeah.
That's something we could do in all of our content areas.
Absolutely. That can be a really powerful addition to a focus cluster, either gearing towards your final product if it's some kind of presentation, or just as part of your instructional ladder if you really want to have seminar discussion, other forms of verbal interaction as part of the learning process as students move towards a final product. Great insight. What else?
I thought it was important to note, sorry, it's like radio feedback, to note that you can use the literacy standard to increase the rigor of the content standard. So to keep that in mind, because a lot of those content standards are DOK 1. Yeah. And so you can use those ELA standards to increase that rigor.
Yeah, that's been so powerful in the work that I've seen people do, because if you have DOK 1 content standards, which is common in so many places, you can use the literacy standard, like you said, to elevate that, and you're still doing what you need to do for the standard, but also going beyond it, right? So you don't have to be limited by the cognitive demand of the standard itself.
It helped me a lot to understand that focus standards, that there are those 3 focus standards that I think we had so many different standards we were trying to put in there because there were so many supporting pieces. And so to help clarify, you have 3 main focus, and yes, you're always going to have other things that are supporting that. That just helps narrow the focus of the work for me.
Mm-hmm. I have to say that was a huge insight for me, because as you start plugging in all of those standards you think you need to have, your module just became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So you're doing a 9-week unit on one key content standard. Well, no wonder I was struggling to get all my content done in the year. So I really like how the content reading and writing focus gives that really honed in 1 to 2 week in-depth learning, so you don't feel like you have to spend weeks and weeks and weeks on one module.
That's absolutely key. And I think it also helps if you know you have to narrow to just this focus cluster. Of course, there will be supporting standards alongside of it, but it really helps stimulate that thinking about like, what's the best standard to use here? What standard is the best fit for this content or the kind of thinking that I want kids to do? Because making the decision about which standard to use is ultimately even more important than figuring out how to align your task to a given standard that you've selected. And so that initial thinking about the cluster that will drive the work is what we're going to really dive into for the rest of today and your work between now and next week. And before we move on to starting that thinking, there's one really key point that I want to make about focus standards, especially in thinking about selecting that reading standard. And this is relevant to all disciplines, but in some ways, I think particularly outside of ELA, where you're using a reading standard to complement a content standard. And I'm going to share my screen really quickly and pull up the anchor standards mental markers kind of quick reference sheet that you probably saw in your face-to-face launch as you were doing mental markers to kind of get familiar with the standards. When you're looking at the reading standards, which are here on the left-hand side, what we typically encourage you to do is to select your focus standards from between 2 and 9, right? We've got 10 reading standards, but we've really found that it's 2 through 9 that make the most sense as focus standards. And we encourage you not to use R1 or R10 as focus standards. So let's think a little bit about why that is. Let's start with R1, right? R1, incredibly important standard, right? Making inferences using evidence from text. Why do you think it is that we would say, don't use R1 as a focus standard for a module?
Well, basically, you can do everything in standards 2 through 9 in conjunction with standard 1, that they always need to be paired up. So if you're reading explicitly, making inferences and citing from the text,
yep.
Standards 2 through 9 tell you what you're citing about or what you're making inferences about. So they should always be kind of paired up, 1 and then 1 with 2 through 9.
That's a perfect explanation. I could not have said it better myself, right? Standard 1 is always in play. There's always going to be making inferences, always citing evidence to support something. But like you said, it doesn't really give you guidance about, what it is that you're supporting or a certain way to approach a text, right? The other standards give you a specific lens through which to understand the text, a lens of thinking about main idea, or development, or language, structure. All of these kinds of things give you a way of interacting with the text that R1 really doesn't do. And R1 is always hardwired into an LDC task prompt. It's impossible not to use it because this support your discussion with evidence from the texts is part of the template. It's constantly there. So R1 is a really, really important supporting standard that's always in play, but it's not really useful as a focus standard. And I think that it's similar for R10, right? Read and comprehend grade level texts. That's more of like an end of the year goal that all of these other standards move you towards. And so it doesn't really make sense as a focus standard because, again, it doesn't guide the way that you would actually interact with text in a module. So as you're doing this thinking about, which focus standards do I want to use, really keep in this territory of 2 through 9, because that's where you get like meaty ways of thinking and interacting with text that help students develop those key literacy skills. All right. So I'm going to take a very quick detour and in the chat, because I haven't had the opportunity to hear what you all are thinking about designing for your own modules. Before we go into doing some thinking and modeling together about how to make these decisions, I would love for everybody to just quickly post in the chat, what is it that you're thinking about designing a module for? Is it a specific text or a specific content topic? Where is your starting place for a module right now? And what this will do is not only give me a little insight into what you're thinking about, but it will also help identify maybe where folks in this group are working on similar ideas or similar disciplines and would be great as thinking partners and kind of feedback buddies as we move through the design process in these 8 weeks. So take a quick moment to just post in the chat. What are you thinking about? Do you want to write a module about the Great Gatsby? Do you want to write a module about photosynthesis? What is it that you're thinking about to drive your task design? And in response to the question in the chat about when you should be considering implementing this, that's totally flexible and up to you. You certainly want to give yourself enough time to get it fully designed. We're going to be really focusing on the task over these 8 weeks, and then we won't even really be looking at the instructional ladder until next semester, but you could be thinking about design for any point in the year.
Where's my
All right, I know some folks are experiencing internet difficulties. Thank you for joining back on. What we're doing right now is just briefly sharing in the chat what you're thinking about designing a module for. So a topic or a text that you have in mind for designing your task for this course.
Nicole. We have quite a few people in Christian County who are not in classrooms. So the people you're looking at today, a lot of them are coaches, instructional coaches within the district or in schools. And so the four of us here in the room at the district level, and then our ladies over in Coach's Corner, we're wondering, what is the, are they all shaking their head? We're wondering what the parameters are around how much of this has to be individual as far as creating the task in the module, or can we work with the teacher in the district, or maybe one that's going through the LDC Learn process? How much of that do we need to do independently, or what does that look like for us?
That's a great question. So I think the answer is you are welcome and even encouraged to think about designing a module for or with a teacher who would actually use it in their classroom. I think having that real context makes the design process easier, more relevant, and then it's useful, right? You're designing something that somebody can actually use with their students, and the collaboration there can also be really powerful. So we're asking you to kind of take the lead on the design process to really develop the competencies about thinking through focus standards and alignment and all of those components. But if you can do it in a way that is supporting a teacher in your building or in your area, that's great. So I think that's a lovely idea.
Thank you for clarifying. I know all of us were kind of sitting around looking at it and wondering, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, why design a module just to go off into the ether and not be used? So I think that's a very powerful approach. All right, lots of exciting ideas for modules coming into the chat. Keep posting if you haven't already. We're going to spend about 10 minutes now just kind of taking a test case to almost model or think together around what does it look like to really go through this design process, to figure out the right focus standards for a topic or text, and go from there to the beginning of an actual task prompt. So we probably won't get too deep into it today. We'll pick it back up next week. But what we're going to do is look at a short text together and start thinking through this process of, if I have a really wonderful, powerful text in front of me, how do I make decisions about focus standards to get to a task prompt? And we are going to be doing this with a text. I'm going to ask Danielle to put a link in the chat for us, which is to the Integrated Bus Suggestions from 1956. So this is a wonderful primary text Dr. Martin Luther King published at the time of the integration of the Montgomery bus system. And we picked this as a starting place to think through some of these task decisions together, because it's a great example of a starting point for a task that is a really rich and interesting but short text, right? You could do a module around this text in a week or two that could be really powerful, and you could do it in social studies or you could do it in ELA, depending on how you chose to approach this text and turn it into a task. So I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes now to open that text. I'm sharing it on my screen, but Danielle has posted a link in the chat for you to open it on your own browser. And take a few minutes simply to read this text so that we can start talking about it together and thinking about how we could design a task using this text as the base. All right, so I know I only gave you a couple minutes there. You might not have had a chance to get really deeply into the text, but hopefully some ideas are sparking a little bit about how you could engage students in a task around this text. So what we're going to do now is talk through kind of the decisions you would need to make if you wanted to take this text and build a task from it, right? So the first decision in this case would be, do I want to take this in a social studies direction or do I want to take this in an ELA direction, right? Now, I'm an ELA person, full disclosure. So my brain is kind of popping around like, what reading standards could I really look at with this text? But it's certainly a really, really powerful historical text as well. So if you're in a social studies context, any social studies buffs in the group out there? A little bit, okay. What you would want to think about is like, what content standard could this text really help you access and engage with students? You would really want to start with that content standard, because all of your other decisions in the task design would be in service of those deep content understandings that you want kids to walk away from. As I'm looking at this from like an ELA literacy perspective, my question is, what are the really interesting features of this text that point me towards specific reading standards that would make sense in my focus cluster? So I'm going to share my screen one more time. And what I have side by side is the text itself and the standards mental markers document, right? I'm not at the grade level specific standards yet. I'm just thinking about the overarching standards and which ones here might be useful for engaging this text. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. As you read through that text and you think about these different standards, what were some of the interesting features of the text that point you towards some of these standards? Which standards might you use with this text, in other words? We've got multiple groups going at once right now, so you can see Suzanne in there highlighting. She may also be thinking about this question. Okay, several people pointed to R6, right? So funny, everyone went straight there. That's exactly where I went as well, right? Point of view or purpose. There's so much interesting point of view and purpose going on in this document. It's one page, it's a list of suggestions, and yet it is like rife with complicated purpose and point of view. So I wholeheartedly agree. Point of view is going to be really important here. So for ELA, our next question would be, how is this author conveying his point of view or purpose? Is it the word choice? Is it the structure? What is that second reading standard that would really help us get at the author's craft in terms of how he's conveying a certain point of view or purpose? And I think there's multiple possible answers here, right? So what are your thoughts about a second reading standard that could really dovetail with point of view or purpose to get us into deep textual analysis here? Got to vote for R4. More votes for R4. We're on the same page. This is exactly what I was thinking. So somebody who posted R4, what made you choose that? Where do you see language in this text that you would want to focus on in terms of how it conveys point of view or purpose? And you might want to unmute and just jump into the conversation here. Coming back to the text. What made you think R4?
I think in what we're going through in our society today, the emphasis on peacefulness and respect, those types of words and phrases would really hit home for students, because you can put them in juxtaposition to what's going on in our society.
One of the things that I was thinking about is looking at how language changes over time, and how meaning can sometimes move with us through history, and how things mean one thing at one time and mean something else at a different time, and really looking at how language just changes.
Oh, interesting. So you could take this text and pair it with a contemporary text and do some thinking of maybe about how even the very same words are used in very different ways. Really interesting. Yeah. What else?
I was thinking about the language he uses here in this piece, and he's communicating with a audience that needed direct instruction, and we're thinking about how that language impacts and shapes his purpose, because we're thinking about how those two standards come together, right?
Yes.
So the way that he uses even the format of the page, and I know that's not a language standard, but the way that it's a list, it's suggestions, the way he offers it as suggestions, not dictates or something like that. It you could study the language in terms of that purpose. And then I think students would need to have some direction around what some of these words mean. I mean, right? So always that standard 4 is going to kind of be in the background of everything you do in conjunction with standards 1 and 10 as well. But the way this language is pretty simple, very straightforward, it'd be a way for you to analyze that purpose. So the way to combine is really important.
I so agree. And it's interesting because the language is simple on the surface in the sense that it's not hard to comprehend overall what's being said here, but there are such shades of meaning in the language, right? Like I look at point number 7 in the first list: be quiet but friendly, proud but not arrogant, joyous but not boisterous, right? Taking those words that, like, in a student's mind might look like synonyms and unpacking the shades of meaning that make them very different in terms of how people interact with one another in these fraught social situations. So much potential there for learning around those nuances of meaning. So lots of exciting stuff here. So if I were going to take this text and create a task for it, I'm just going to quickly model how I would go about selecting my focus standards just from a technology perspective. So you all have already, I think, created and set up a module. So you wouldn't be doing this step that I'm taking right now to actually create a prototype. But what you will be doing in the Learn tab this week is going back into your module and selecting your focus standards. Even if you're not 100% locked in on what they are yet, you're going to take your first pass at deciding your focus standards. Excuse me. And then from there, we'll think about how to build from the standards to the actual task prompt. So we'll come back to this same text next week and practice that piece a little bit together before you go on and do it with your own. But my first step here would be, I've started a new module. I'm going to set my grade level to 7th for this, just kind of as a starting point. And I'm going to select my standards. So that is going to be right in section 1, what task, below the task template. Before I even get into, I don't know about my task template yet. I haven't done thinking about that yet. But for my standards, I'm going to hit edit. There's nothing there yet, so I'm going to add standards. It's already set to grade 7, since that's what I selected for my module. And in this case, we are looking at an informational text. So I'm going to stick with these RI standards. So I'm going to scroll down to RI 7.6, determine an author's point of view or purpose in a text, which is what we all agreed was a great starting point here. And I am going to add it, and I'm going to click the box that says focus. And I'm also going to add RI 4, right? Determine the meanings of words and phrases, including figurative, connotative meanings, analyze the impact of those word choices on meaning and tone. And I'm going to hit focus, and I'm going to add those. Now they appear in my module, but I'm still missing a writing standard. So I'm going to go back in and toggle into the writing section. And here I kind of have a decision to make about if I want to go in an argumentative direction with my task or an informational explanatory. I'm definitely leaning towards informational explanatory in this case because I'm really thinking it's an analysis of the text, right? It's not really a topical argument or an evaluation. So for the time being, I'm just going to select the umbrella standard of W2, right? Informative explanatory texts. I might come back to this later and select a substandard to really zero in on something I want to emphasize in my instructional ladder as I work the kids through the writing process. But I'm not quite there yet in my thinking. So I'm just going to stick with the umbrella standard, W2, write informative explanatory texts. Again, select it, hit focus, and add. And now when I hit save, I've got my focus cluster. So this will be my starting point next week as I think about, given these standards, what is my task prompt going to look like? Which cognitive demand do I select? How do I word that prompt to really call for the demands of those standards?
Nicole, several people mentioned that they hadn't created a module yet. So could you go back and show them how they can get that prototype?
Absolutely.
How to
Sorry
start
about that.
No problem.
Apologies, I'm making assumptions that are not true here. Okay, so if you have not actually created or set up a new module yet, what you're going to do is start in Core Tools. You're going to start in My Library, and you'll use that big red Create button in the upper right-hand corner. And we are going to create a new module. We can also send around some instructions for this. And you're going to select Create from Prototype. And the reason for that is we have a handy dandy template to start with that has just kind of a basic instructional ladder that you'll be able to customize later as opposed to starting completely from scratch. But you're going to select this 1 week, 1 text module template, which is the very first option on the list, and select create from prototype. It's going to think for a while. Spinny, spin, spin, spin. Come on, Core Tools.
And the 1 week, 1 text module will give you a nice instructional ladder with some skills and mini tasks already populated in there, so that it's a nice starting place when we do get to the instructional ladder component. So we're doing that step right now so that you don't end up with a blank instructional ladder when we're ready to start skills and instruction later.
Exactly. And I know it's called 1 week, 1 text, but even if you're thinking about multiple texts or 2 weeks, it's fine. This is still a really useful template for you. The point is that it's kind of a concise module template. All right, so this is not wanting to cooperate with me right now. We're all having internet issues, I guess. There we go. So anyway, once it pops up, you'll see by your name, as you're the author, adapted from the template. And it'll just have, you can go in and kind of make your decisions about your grade level, your discipline, your course, and play around with standards and everything else. And there is some helpful information in the course content as well that can walk you through this process. So we'll make sure to include a pointer to that in our follow-up email from this session so that you don't have to just kind of remember what we just did. All right, folks, we're coming up on our ending time. So I'm going to take just a quick minute to clarify our next steps before you go. And then we will send a follow-up email probably on Monday that will have a link to the recording. So if there are parts you missed as your internet was taking you in and out, you can revisit those. It'll have the chat log so that you can see what we talked about in the chat. And it will have a summary of your next steps before our meeting next week. So to summarize what those next steps are, you really have 2 key things to do before we meet again next Friday. One, and it sounds like a lot of you are already kind of thinking about this, one is to identify a small group of teachers that you could work with over the course of these 8 weeks, just to try out little things here and there from your professional learning. It's not going to be a super formal or structured thing, but the idea is we want you to think about who are some teachers that you could work with to go through, analyzing standards or thinking about modules or anything like that. And there'll be a spreadsheet where you can populate the names of the people that you are choosing to work with. We only ask you to do that so we can make sure that they have access to everything in Core Tools that they would need to do this work with you. And then the really key step is going to be to complete session 2 in instructional cycle 1. Again, we'll send this out in the email, and it's also in the syllabus, which really is about selecting your focus standards, just like we practiced together just now. So that will be the key starting place for your module design. And when we come back together next week, we'll be thinking about how to go from standards to cognitive demand and task. That will all be in the email, and it's all there in the quality task syllabus. So don't worry if you're getting tired of listening to my voice and didn't catch all that. All right, thanks Danielle for posting the quality task syllabus link. So before we go, we always have a little tradition of ending each session with a final word whip, which is just a really quick reflection in the chat. And the question is pretty much always the same. What is one thing that you are thinking about as you're leaving this session today? Maybe something that resonated with you. It could be one word or it could be a little bit more, but just let us know something that's on your mind as you're leaving the session today. And that will basically be your ticket out the door. Danielle and I will stick around for a little while to answer any questions or troubleshoot with you. But once you have posted your reflection in the chat, if you don't have any questions, then you're free to go. And we look forward to seeing you same time, same place next week. Awesome. Powerful words.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Do we want to, CCPS instructional coaches, do we want to bring that, have a conversation?